Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and all welcome aboard the Eastern Express. This time around, we're diving into a relationship that's as cold as the freezer aisle, the strained dynamic between Belarus and Lithuania. The country led by Alexander Lukashenko, a man who's essentially the rent-stabilized tenant of Eastern European dictatorships, has decided that maybe it's time to play nice with one of his biggest critics, Lithuania. Now, I know what you're thinking. Belarus and Lithuania, weren't they throwing diplomatic daggers at each other just, last week? Well, yes, but international politics is a weird place. And just like in your family holiday dinners, grudges can turn into olive branches when someone needs something. So, what does Minsk need? Well, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
In a recent op-ed for the state-run Belarus Today media outlet, Belarusian Foreign Minister Maxim Ryzhenkov spoke about why it would be beneficial for Lithuania to patch up its relations with Belarus. The official called for the revival of cooperation in the railway transit industry and for the reopening of border crossings to stimulate shopping on the Belarusian side of the border and boost Lithuania's imports and exports. He also claimed that Lithuanians' wallets were suffering due to the inaccessibility of Belarus-manufactured goods such as light bulbs. These arguments, along with several others, show the areas in which Belarus's economy is struggling, and Lukashenko's regime along with it. This is because the Belarusian economic model, with its oppressive state control, is a thing of the Soviet past. State-owned enterprises dominate key sectors of the economy, including energy, manufacturing, and agriculture. In his op-ed, FM Ryzhenkov alluded to every single one of these sectors.
Lukashenko's regime is complicit in the vicious attack against Ukraine.
Western sanctions imposed on Minsk after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 resulted in an economic decline in Belarus's key sectors, which are heavily reliant on exports to the West and on Western finance. This is why Minsk is now speaking in a reconciliatory tone, offering Vilnius normalization of the migration situation at the border.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Now, let me give you some context. In 2020, Belarus had an election that wasn't exactly an election, more like a race where you're the only person who's allowed to cross the finish line, and even then, you get to move the finish line wherever you want. And that's what happened. Lukashenko claimed victory, and the people of Belarus said, uh-oh. Then the protest started. Well, how did he respond? The only way any ruler with a penchant for autocracy would. He cracked down hard. Now, this led to a diplomatic fallout that saw Belarus become one of the most isolated countries in Europe. The EU slapped on sanctions, and countries like Lithuania became vocal critics, taking in opposition leaders and offering support to Belarusian dissidents. So, why is Belarus now offering to reset its relationship with Lithuania? Lukashenko has been under Russia's wing for a long time, but even Moscow's support can't offset the economic pain Belarus is feeling from being cut off from the West. And with Russia a little occupied by, ongoing war in Ukraine, Lukashenko might be thinking it's time to hedge his bets. After all, when your Botox-filled sugar daddy starts running out of sugar, you've got to start looking at other options. So, Belarus is now floating the idea of a reset with Lithuania. The pitch? A good neighborly relationship. Lithuania, on the other hand, isn't so sure. I mean, can you blame them? They've been dealing with Lukashenko's shenanigans for decades, and what would this reset even look like? According to Belarus, it could involve everything from more trade to better political ties, and yeah, that sounds nice on paper, but let's be real for a second. It's hard to trust someone when, for the last few years, they've been treating your house like a personal landfill. And even if Lithuania wanted to take Belarus up on this offer, they're not exactly free agents. Lithuania is part of the European Union, and any warming of relations with Belarus would have to navigate the tricky waters of sanctions. Not to mention the fact that the EU as a whole hasn't exactly softened its stance on Lukashenko's regime. Let's not forget the looming presence of Russia in all of this. Belarus is essentially a Russian satellite state at this point, and if Belarus makes any moves towards the west, they're going to have to clear it with Moscow first. But hey, stranger things have happened. Lukashenko might genuinely be looking to pivot. After all, he's a survivor, and like any good survivor, he's willing to adapt when necessary. Maybe he sees the writing on the wall. Russia's grip is weakening, the West is still strong, and maybe now is the time to start mending fences. Of course, the other possibility is that this whole reset is just Lukashenko doing what he does best, playing both sides in an attempt to get whatever he can out of whoever is willing to give it to him. So, should Lithuania take the bait? Honestly, tough call. On one hand, dialogue is always better than silence, but as much as better relations would benefit the entire regions, engaging with Minsk regime has not been beneficial as of late. Ultimately, the ball is in Lithuania's court. They could open the door a crack and see what Belarus is really offering, or they could slam it shut and continue their hardline stance. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Renato Kotel from the Forum of Democratic Forces of Belarus. Hello, sir, and thanks for being with us on the Eastern Express.
Hello, nice to see you.
So today we are trying to explore the relation between Lithuania and Belarus. We do know that Lithuania is one of the first countries to sound off on the situation when it comes to the election, and the two countries haven't been getting along very well ever since. However, Belarus is seemingly trying to re-establish that connection. Why now, and what's the incentive?
Actually, it's not about re-establishment some connections with Lithuania. It's more about Belarusian so-called elections, which will be held next year. I mean, presidential electoral campaign. And Lukashenko needs to have something at least to bargain with Kremlin, and the only product he has been selling for almost 30 years. It was the denial of the good relationship with Western countries. Now he has no this product anymore since 2020. And especially since February 2022, he is not recognized as a legitimate president of Belarus. Moreover, he is recognized as a co-aggressor in the war against Ukraine. But the time is passing by. He wants to have some arguments to go for new 5-year term as a dictator in Belarus, and he doesn't need support of of his people. He needs support from Kremlin. By this moment, he hasn't got an answer from Kremlin yet, and that's why he is trying to make to play some imitation game that he has a good relationship with at least one of his neighbors, either Poland or now Lithuania. So this is not about his intention to rebuild some connections. So this is only about his intention to have something in hands to sell it to Kremlin. And by the way, he is in Moscow right now.
Right, so this is a very interesting situation. Like you mentioned, perhaps one of the things that the Kremlin, in order for the Kremlin to accept Lukashenko, is him cutting ties to the West. However, with the ties already cut, there's not a lot more to cut. So perhaps Lukashenko is trying to bring in some more friends than he can later on toss away on Moscow's behalf. Do you think that would work well, though, when it comes to Moscow's perspectives? Won't they see what's actually going on behind the scenes?
Actually, we have witnessed many times previously that Moscow is buying such things from Lukashenko's hands. Probably now Moscow would be eager to buy this product again, as Moscow has no other close allies, Moscow has to pay big money to keep at least one ally loyal, and Lukashenko tries to take all the advantages from that. But as I said, at the moment, Lukashenko has no any relationship with Western countries. He has no good or at least normal relationship with neither Poland nor Lithuania. So he tries to create this product artificially, even a declaration of some negotiation could work here, but by the moment the answer from all sides he receives sounds, I would say, in a similar way, and the answer is simple, it's short, and it sounds like no. We do not want any normalization with dictatorship without any changes inside Belarus itself. It just makes no sense. So even the so-called solution of migration crisis now is worth nothing, because all the countries, all the neighboring countries, I mean Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, has got prepared for the migration crisis, even at larger scale on their boundaries.
All right, so that's a very interesting situation. It looks like in Lukashenko's mind, he's playing some complicated 4D underwater upside-down chess, while the rest of the world seeing him playing checkers and playing it very bad. But when it comes to Moscow and the Kremlin's incentive, we know that Lukashenko is pretty much a Moscow puppet at this point. Isn't it in their best interest to keep Lukashenko in and for him to be easier to control? Or are there any other incentive on the Kremlin's part to stop backing Lukashenko?
I guess Kremlin has made its own decision even in 2020. So Kremlin is not satisfied with Lukashenko's behavior, and it's better to control Belarus, and it's easier to control Belarus without Lukashenko himself. But it has been agreed that he would step out peacefully and slowly within some sort of political transit where there were many rumors or talks about so-called Kazakhstan option or Kazakhstan variant of him stepping down. But unfortunately for Moscow, even inside Kazakhstan, this option hadn't worked out perfectly well. So Lukashenko is trying to keep and to preserve his power. He is trying to negotiate with Kremlin, but by the moment there is no yes answer also from Moscow side for his seventh term as a dictator in Belarus. Moscow thinks that it would be easier to control Belarus if there is no Lukashenko, even if Belarus turns, according to the recent changes to the constitution introduced by Lukashenko, to some sort of more parliamentary republic. It will be easier for Moscow to control Belarus if Lukashenko is out. He is not 100% loyal to Kremlin.
So what you're saying is actually very much alarming. A lot of times when we discuss Belarus, we discuss Russia and Lukashenko, we pretty much paint him as the de facto puppet of Putin and the tool that he uses to control Belarus. So are we looking at a situation where perhaps him being out of power would actually bring Belarus closer to the Kremlin's control and apparatus?
Unfortunately, it's true. It's sad but true, like in famous zone, because during these almost 5 years since 2020, Lukashenko tried to clear out Belarus from his opponents, but at the same time, Russia was the only one, the final beneficiary of this process, because Lukashenko has not only fought his opponents, but any type of Belarusians in Belarus. So he cleared the country, he wiped out all the possible opposition, not only for him, but also for Moscow. And this is extremely dangerous situation for the sovereignty of country itself. And in such situation, he has become more dependent on Moscow. But this is true, and Moscow is, I would say, enjoying this situation. But on the other hand, there are some red lines Lukashenko tries not to cross. He has not agreed by the moment to engage in a full-scale war against Ukraine, and this is also a pain for Kremlin. Then their closest and the only, in fact, ally is denying support for the master, actually, and this is some sort of paradoxical situation. Then Lukashenko tries to preserve his power, even to some extent against Kremlin, and Kremlin is enjoying situation of the dependent of Lukashenko, but still he wants to get him out, because after that Kremlin gets a full control on the Belarusian territory.
Right, so yeah, paradoxical is probably the best way to describe the situation in Belarus, stuck between a rock and a very hard place. You either have a Kremlin-controlled Lukashenko controlling Belarus, or you have direct control of Kremlin to Belarus. A very difficult situation there. Meanwhile, thank you so much for all your input and insight and helping us understand the situation a little bit more. Thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Thank you. See you.
And now we move on to the Eastern Newsflash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Now, whenever Ukraine's NATO membership is discussed, Article 5 of the alliance is often cited as a clause that could immediately draw all North Atlantic Treaty signatories into war with Russia. However, recent comments from NATO's former Secretary General are casting doubt on that assumption.
Former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has proposed that Ukraine could potentially join NATO, even if parts of its territory remained under Russian occupation. In an interview with the Financial Times, Stoltenberg suggested that there could be ways to address the issue of Article 5. If the Ukrainian territory, considered part of NATO, was not necessarily the internationally recognized border. He emphasized the importance of Ukraine maintaining control over the territory that NATO would encompass under Article 5. With the Ramstein summit coming up on October 12th, Stoltenberg's remarks are especially significant. Reportedly, more concrete steps on NATO membership are to be offered to Ukraine during the conference, where Kyiv hopes to secure additional pledges of assistance.
Despite previous peace proposals from Russia, which Ukraine deemed unacceptable, new reports suggest that Russian President Vladimir Putin has largely abandoned any pretense of being a peacemaker.
Sources close to the Kremlin have said that following Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region and the resulting humiliation of Vladimir Putin, the Russian leader will be unwilling to exchange Ukraine-held territory in Kursk for Russian gains in Ukraine. The cited sources said that earlier this year, the warring parties were within reach of a de-escalation deal that included a mutual ban on targeting energy facilities and a restriction on the use of various weaponry and strikes further than a defined distance from the front line. A report by the Institute for the Study of War said that Russia planned to allocate $948 million for one-off payments to people signing military contacts with the Russian Ministry of Defense between 2025 and 2027. This move indicates that the Kremlin intends to continue their mobilization efforts to replenish losses among forces engaged on Ukrainian territory and thus continue the war.
And there's more coming out of Russia. Senior officials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have removed the Taliban from their list of terrorist organizations. Here are the details.
Although the decision to delist the Taliban as a terrorist entity has been made, legal procedures, as Putin's special representative on Afghanistan noted, still needs to be completed. The announcement follows Putin's July statement that Moscow saw Afghanistan's Taliban as an ally in the fight against terrorism. Russia has gradually warmed up to the group, following their return to power in Afghanistan in August 2021. Russia has also urged the West to lift sanctions on Taliban-led Afghanistan and advocated for the Taliban's inclusion in discussions about the country's future. On Friday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov emphasized the need to engage with the Taliban administration, despite Moscow's lack of formal recognition of the group. This stance stands in stark contrast with the US position, which continues to support sanctions against the Taliban regime.
And to conclude this Eastern News Flash, we'll review the results of Kazakhstan's highly controlled nuclear power referendum. Take a look.
The construction of a nuclear power plant in the village of Ulkan in the Almaty region on the shores of Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan was supported by a little over 71% voters who took part in a referendum on Sunday. According to the Central Referendum Commission, the turnout at the nationwide plebiscite was almost 64%, easily surpassing the required 50% level to be considered valid and representing 7.82 million people. Supporters of the idea to build Kazakhstan's first post-Soviet era nuclear power plant say the facility will help cut reliance on coal. Opponents highlighted the expensiveness of the project and an environmental hazard it may pose. Observers reported irregularities at polling stations that included declaration of higher than factual turnout and at least one person dropping off more than just one ballot. At least 26 activists opposing the nuclear power plant scheme were detained 2 days ahead of the referendum.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.